Mother and daughter now facing charges tonight in the murder of their 71-year-old mother and grandmother. Police say the two went to horrible lengths to try and cover up the crime. It happened at a home along Hill Road in Landover. Police were called to check in on the welfare of 71-year-old Margaret Craig. Police say that evidence shows the woman's daughter and granddaughter used a chainsaw and backyard grill to dispose of the body. Their next-door neighbors saying that she saw the fires but had no idea what was going on.
The time that the officer arrived at the home, they were allowed to enter the home by one of the residents. In the basement, they uncovered the putrefying remains of the decedent in this case.
Investigators say 44-year-old Candace Craig murdered 71-year-old Margaret Craig last week. They found the woman's remains during a welfare check yesterday at a home on Hill Road in Landover Hills. Candace's daughter, 19-year-old Salia Hardy, is also facing charges for allegedly helping hide her grandmother's body. Police are still working to determine a motive and cause of death.
June 2nd. 2023, Hyattsville, Maryland. Police arrived at a quiet home to check on a missing grandmother. 71-year-old Margaret Craig hadn't been seen for days. Someone close to her grew worried and asked authorities to perform a welfare check. When officers knocked on the door, it wasn't a stranger who answered. It was her daughter. 44-year-old Candace Craig opened the door and let the officers inside. At first, everything seemed normal. The house was quiet, but there were no signs of a break-in, no obvious signs of violence. But within seconds, the officers noticed something that immediately made them uneasy: a powerful smell. Investigators recognized it right away. The smell of decomposition. The odor seemed to be coming from the basement. As officers carefully walked downstairs, the situation changed from a routine welfare check to something far more serious. On the basement floor, they saw blood. Nearby were several white plastic trash bags, and inside one of those bags, officers discovered something that confirmed their worst fears. Margaret Craig was not missing. She was dead. But what shocked investigators even more was what they began to uncover next. Because the evidence inside that basement suggested something deeply disturbing had happened inside the family home. And according to police, the people responsible were not strangers. They were members of Margaret Craig's own family. Before we continue, it's important to pause for a moment and acknowledge what this story represents. The case you're about to hear is not fiction. It involves real people, a real family, and a tragedy that ended the life of a 71-year-old woman named Margaret Craig. What began as a simple welfare check by police officers in Hyattsville, Maryland, quickly turned into a disturbing homicide investigation that shocked the community and raised painful questions about what had been happening inside that home. According to investigators in Prince George's County, the discovery inside the basement revealed evidence of a violent crime. Court documents later described a scene involving blood, human remains, and tools that authorities believe were used in an attempt to hide what had happened. Police say the case involved members of Margaret Craig's own family, people she trusted and lived with. Because of the nature of this crime, some of the details discussed in this video may be upsetting to some viewers. The case includes allegations of violence, dismemberment, and attempts to dispose of human remains. While we will present the facts carefully and respectfully, the subject matter itself is disturbing. This video is not meant to sensationalize the tragedy or exploit the loss of life. Instead, the goal is to examine the case through the lens of a true crime documentary, focusing on the investigation, through the timeline of events, and how authorities were able to uncover what they believe happened inside that house. cases like this also serve as a reminder that behind every headline is a human story. Margaret Craig was more than a victim in a police report. She was a mother, a grandmother, and someone who had lived a long life before the events that led to her death. The people involved in this case were not strangers connected by chance. They were family members living under the same roof. For viewers who are sensitive to stories involving violent crime or family-related tragedies, this may be a difficult case to listen to. If at any point you feel uncomfortable, please use your discretion before continuing. True crime stories can sometimes be hard to process because they force us to confront the darker side of human behavior, especially when the people involved share close relationships. But they also provide insight into how investigators work, how evidence is uncovered, and how justice systems respond when something goes terribly wrong. As we move forward in this documentary, we'll walk through the timeline of events based on publicly available reports, charging documents, and statements released by authorities. The purpose is to understand what investigators say happened, how the case unfolded, and how a quiet home in a Maryland neighborhood became the center of a shocking criminal investigation. But to truly understand how police ended up discovering what they did in that basement, we have to go back before the welfare check, before the investigation, and before the crime itself. We have to look at the people who lived in that house. We have to start with Margaret Craig. Margaret Craig was 71 years old. To investigators, she would eventually become the victim at the center of one of the most disturbing family crimes in Prince George's County. But long before police officers stepped into that basement, Margaret Craig was simply a mother, a grandmother, and a woman who had spent decades building a life with her family. She lived in a quiet neighborhood in Prince George's County, Maryland, in a modest home on Hill Road. It was the same home where several members of her family lived together, including her daughter, Candace Craig, and her granddaughter, Salia Hardy. Margaret was part of a large extended family, and relatives described her as someone they stayed in regular contact with. According to family members who later spoke in court, it was unusual for her to suddenly disappear or stop answering calls. When relatives couldn't reach her for several days, it immediately raised concern. That concern would eventually lead to the welfare check that exposed what investigators believe had already happened inside the home. But before the tragedy unfolded, Margaret Craig's life revolved around family, and she was known by relatives as Auntie Joyce, a nickname that reflected both affection and familiarity within the family circle. She was originally from Trinidad and Tobago, and was known for enjoying Caribbean food and traditions that connected her to her roots. Photos shown during the later court proceedings captured a much different image of Margaret than the one investigators encountered in the basement. In one photograph presented to jurors, she was sitting on a couch beside a Christmas tree, smiling. A snapshot of an elderly woman surrounded by family memories. By the time of her death, Margaret was in fragile health. Family members testified that she had suffered several strokes and was taking medication. Her health problems had limited her independence. She could no longer drive and relied more heavily on others in the household for help with daily life. Because of her condition, Margaret depended heavily on the people living with her, especially her daughter. Candace Craig, who was in her mid-40s, shared the home with her mother and her own daughter, Salia. 3 generations of the same family living under one roof. At first glance, It may have appeared to outsiders as a family simply taking care of one another. An elderly mother being looked after by her daughter and granddaughter. But investigators would later begin to uncover evidence that the relationship inside that house was far more complicated. Prosecutors would eventually claim that tensions had been building for some time. According to court records and testimony presented during the case, Margaret Craig had become suspicious about financial activity involving her accounts. Authorities later alleged that Candace Craig had been using her mother's money, including pension and Social Security benefits. At some point, Margaret confronted her daughter about it. That confrontation would become one of the most important moments in the entire investigation. According to witness statements and charging documents, Margaret Craig allegedly threatened to report her daughter to police over fraudulent use of her credit card and finances. What might have started as a family dispute over money was about to escalate into something far more serious. And according to investigators, and the argument that followed inside that house would ultimately end Margaret Craig's life. But at the time, none of the neighbors around that quiet Maryland home knew what had happened. Days passed. Margaret Craig stopped answering calls. Family members grew worried, and soon, someone would make a call that would change everything. A request for police to check on a grandmother who had suddenly gone silent. Inside the house on Hill Road in Prince George's County, 3 generations of the same family were living together. At the center of it all was Margaret Craig, the 71-year-old grandmother whose disappearance would eventually lead police to that basement. Living with her was her daughter, Candace Craig, and Candace's teenage daughter, Salia Hardy. It was a family arrangement that, on the surface, might have seemed ordinary. An elderly parent living with her adult child and grandchild under the same roof. But investigators would later learn that the relationships inside that home were far more complicated. Candace Craig was 44 years old at the time of the investigation. She was Margaret Craig's daughter and the primary adult living with her in the house. According to police, Candace had been sharing the home with her mother for some time. It was the same house where Margaret had spent her later years, relying increasingly on the people around her as she grew older. Also living in the home was Candace's daughter, Salia Hardy. Salia was 19 years old. That made her Margaret Craig's granddaughter, the youngest member of the household and the 3rd generation living in the family home. 3 generations: grandmother, daughter, and granddaughter. From the outside, the arrangement might have appeared like a family supporting one another. But as detectives began piecing together what had been happening inside the house, they started to uncover signs that tensions had been building for some time. One of the most important issues involved money. According to investigators and later court testimony, Margaret Craig had become suspicious about financial activity involving her accounts. Authorities would later say that Candace Craig had been using her mother's money without permission, including funds connected to Margaret's credit card and bank accounts. That discovery created a serious conflict inside the household. At some point, Margaret confronted her daughter about the alleged financial activity. What began as a disagreement about money quickly escalated into a much more serious dispute. Investigators say Margaret Craig eventually threatened to report her daughter to the police for fraudulent use of her credit card. That moment would become one of the most important details in the entire case, because, according to statements later given to investigators, that threat triggered the confrontation that followed. Salia Hardy would later tell authorities that her grandmother had accused Candace of stealing money and warned that she was going to involve the police. What happened next, according to investigators, was a violent argument inside the home. At the time, none of the neighbors around the quiet Maryland street had any idea what was unfolding inside the house. To them, it was just another home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. But inside that house, tensions had reached a breaking point. A family dispute about money, accusations, and trust had suddenly escalated into something far darker. And according to police, what happened next would turn that family argument into a homicide investigation. May 23, 2023. Inside the house on Hill Road in Prince George's County, what had been simmering tensions between mother and daughter finally reached a breaking point. Investigators would later say the confrontation began with an argument, one rooted in accusations, money, and a growing sense of betrayal. For some time, Margaret Craig had reportedly become suspicious about activity involving her finances. Prosecutors would later argue that her daughter, Candace Craig, had been using money that did not belong to her, including funds connected to Margaret's credit card, pension, and Social Security income. Margaret eventually confronted her daughter about it. According to statements later given to investigators, the argument escalated quickly. The disagreement wasn't just about money anymore. It had turned into a threat that could bring police into the situation. The witness statements later revealed that Margaret Craig allegedly warned her daughter she was going to report the fraudulent credit card use to authorities. And that threat changed everything. According to charging documents, 19-year-old Salia Hardy, Candace's daughter and Margaret's granddaughter, later told investigators she overheard her grandmother making that threat. She said that after Margaret confronted Candace about the financial activity, the situation suddenly turned violent. Investigators say that was the moment Candace Craig attacked her mother. Exactly how the attack unfolded inside the home has been reconstructed through evidence and statements gathered during the investigation. What detectives believe is clear, however, is that the confrontation ended with Margaret Craig dead inside the house where she had been living with her family. A 71-year-old grandmother had been killed inside her own home. But according to investigators, the story did not end there. And because what happened after the killing would soon become just as shocking as the crime itself. Police believe Candace Craig did not act alone in what came next. According to court documents, her daughter, 19-year-old Salia Hardy, became involved after the killing. Authorities say Hardy later discovered her grandmother's remains and then helped her mother begin trying to get rid of the body. Investigators believe the effort to cover up the crime began almost immediately. The evidence later presented by prosecutors suggested that Candace Craig traveled to stores to purchase items that could be used to dispose of a body, including tools investigators say were later found inside the house. But whatever plan had been put in motion inside that house would eventually unravel. Over the next several days, investigators say there were attempts to clean up evidence, conceal what had happened, and prevent anyone from discovering the truth. Meanwhile, outside the house, our relatives were beginning to worry. Margaret Craig had stopped answering calls. Family members hadn't heard from her in days. And while the people inside the house knew exactly what had happened, no one outside had any idea that a violent crime had already taken place behind those walls. But the evidence left behind inside the home would eventually tell its own story. and because what investigators would later uncover inside the basement suggested an attempt to hide the crime in an extremely disturbing way. According to investigators, what happened after Margaret Craig was killed inside the home was not a moment of panic that quickly came to an end. Instead, authorities say the hours and days that followed were spent trying to hide what had happened. Detectives later reconstructed the timeline using statements, physical evidence, and court testimony. Their conclusion was that the killing was followed by a disturbing attempt to dispose of the body. Authorities say Candace Craig began making plans to conceal the crime almost immediately. At first, prosecutors believe she attempted to burn the body outside the home. According to testimony later presented in court, items such as charcoal, lighter fluid, and other supplies were purchased in preparation for that attempt. The investigators say a fire was started behind the house in an effort to destroy evidence. But the plan did not work the way it was intended. Neighbors reportedly noticed the fire and contacted the fire department, forcing the attempt to stop before it could fully destroy the remains. What happened next, according to investigators, would become one of the most disturbing elements of the case. Authorities say the body was eventually taken back inside the house, and according to court documents and testimony, Candace Craig then used a chainsaw to dismember her mother's remains in the basement of the home. Investigators later found evidence that supported that claim, including a chainsaw cover, cutting tools, and other items consistent with an attempt to break down and dispose of the body. Police say the remains were then placed into plastic trash bags. When investigators later entered the basement, they reported finding multiple white trash bags containing human remains, along with blood and other evidence scattered throughout the area. The discovery would ultimately confirm that the person inside those bags was Margaret Craig. Authorities believe the actions inside the basement were part of a deliberate effort to conceal the crime. Prosecutors later argued that the attempt to destroy and hide the body was meant to prevent anyone from discovering that Margaret Craig had been killed inside the home. Investigators would later tell the court that evidence of cleaning supplies and attempts to remove blood from the scene suggested someone had tried to erase what happened there. But the plan did not work. Despite the effort to hide the evidence, the house itself still held the signs of what had happened, and the smell of decomposition, the traces left behind in the basement, and the missing grandmother who had suddenly stopped answering calls were all clues that would eventually bring police to the door. Outside the house, relatives had already started to notice something was wrong. Days passed without any word from Margaret Craig. For a woman who usually kept in touch with her family, the silence felt unusual. Phone calls went unanswered. Messages were never returned. And eventually, someone close to Margaret Craig became worried enough to contact authorities. That decision, a simple request for police to check on an elderly grandmother, would soon uncover the truth hidden inside that house. For several days, Margaret Craig had simply vanished. To the outside world, it looked like an elderly grandmother had suddenly gone quiet. Phone calls went unanswered. Messages were never returned. Relatives who were used to hearing from her regularly began to worry that something might be wrong. Margaret was 71 years old, and family members knew it wasn't like her to disappear without saying anything. As the days passed without any contact, concern slowly turned into alarm. Eventually, someone who knew Margaret decided it was time to ask for help. A call was placed to authorities in Prince George's County, Maryland. asking officers to perform what is known as a welfare check. It's something police departments do every day, a simple visit to make sure someone is safe when family members can't reach them. At that moment, the person making that call had no idea they were about to trigger the discovery of a homicide. Police officers were dispatched to the home on Hill Road in Hyattsville, the same house where Margaret Craig lived with her daughter and granddaughter. According to reports later released by investigators, officers arrived expecting to simply check on the well-being of an elderly woman who hadn't been heard from in several days. But the moment they arrived at the house, something about the situation began to feel unusual. Officers walked up to the door and knocked. A few moments later, the door opened. Standing there was Margaret's daughter, 44-year-old Candace Craig. According to police reports, Candace spoke with the officers and allowed them to come inside the home. At that point, there were no signs of forced entry, no visible evidence of a struggle in the front areas of the house, and nothing immediately suggesting that a violent crime had taken place. But as the officers stepped inside, something caught their attention almost immediately. A smell. Investigators later described it as the unmistakable odor of decomposition. It wasn't faint. It was strong enough that the officers noticed it within moments of entering the home, and the smell appeared to be coming from somewhere deeper inside the house, specifically from the basement area. For trained investigators, that kind of smell is impossible to ignore. What had started as a routine welfare check was now beginning to look like something much more serious. The officers followed the odor toward the basement. As they moved closer, the smell became stronger. And when they reached the basement area and looked inside, they began to see signs that something terrible had happened. According to charging documents later obtained by reporters, investigators saw blood and what appeared to be tissue on the floor near several white plastic trash bags. In that moment, the situation changed instantly. This was no longer a welfare check. It was now the beginning of a homicide investigation, and what investigators were about to uncover inside that basement would reveal a crime that shocked even experienced detectives in Prince George's County. When officers reached the basement, the smell that had filled the house became overwhelming. For trained investigators, it was immediately recognizable: the odor of decomposition. What they saw next confirmed their fears. According to charging documents later obtained by reporters, officers entering the basement immediately noticed blood and what appeared to be human tissue on the floor. Nearby were several white plastic trash bags that appeared to have been placed together in the area. At first, the officers approached carefully, trying to understand what they were looking at. But as they examined the scene more closely, it became clear that this was not an accident, and it was not a natural death. It was a crime scene. Investigators reported seeing evidence scattered throughout the basement, signs that something violent had happened there, and that someone had attempted to clean it up afterward. Blood spatter could be seen on surfaces around the room. Cleaning materials were present, suggesting that someone may have tried to wash away evidence. But the most disturbing discovery was still inside the bags on the floor. According to police reports, when officers looked inside one of the trash bags, now they saw what appeared to be human remains. In another bag, investigators reported finding material that they believed to be human brain matter. Nearby, investigators also noticed a knife lying on the basement floor. and as they continued examining the room, more evidence began to appear. Detectives found the cover of a chainsaw. They also discovered cutting utensils and other tools that investigators believed may have been used during the dismemberment process. Along with the tools, officers saw additional evidence that someone had attempted to deal with the aftermath, including cleaning supplies that appeared to have been used in an effort to remove blood and other traces from the scene. By this point, the welfare check had officially turned into a homicide investigation. The scene in the basement suggested that a violent crime had taken place inside the home, and that someone had gone to significant lengths to conceal it. But investigators still needed confirmation of one crucial detail. Who was the victim? That answer came after authorities examined the remains discovered inside the trash bags. Investigators later confirmed that the remains belonged to the missing grandmother police had come to check on. Margaret Craig. The 71-year-old woman who had not been heard from for days had now been found, not in another location, but inside the very house where she lived. Her death was no longer a mystery. It was now the focus of a full homicide investigation. And as detectives began reconstructing what had happened inside that home, their attention quickly turned to the people who were still living there. The same people who had been inside the house when officers first knocked on the door. Once the scene inside the basement was secured, detectives began the long process of reconstructing what had happened inside the Craig home. At first, investigators were working with only a few key facts: a missing grandmother, human remains discovered in the basement, and 2 family members who had been living in the house at the time. But as they examined the evidence and reviewed statements, a clearer timeline began to emerge. According to charging documents and later testimony, detectives determined that Margaret Craig had been killed several days earlier, on May 23, 2023. The investigation soon pointed toward a confrontation between Margaret and her daughter, Candace Craig. Authorities believe the argument that day centered around money. Specifically, it involved accusations that Candace had been using her mother's financial accounts without permission. Investigators say Margaret Craig had discovered suspicious activity involving her credit card and bank accounts. The confrontation quickly escalated. According to statements gathered during the investigation, Margaret allegedly threatened to report her daughter to police for fraudulent use of her credit card. That moment would become one of the most important pieces of the case, because investigators believe that threat triggered the violent confrontation that followed. Court documents later stated that after Margaret made the threat, Candace Craig attacked her mother. Exactly how the attack unfolded was pieced together through witness testimony, evidence found in the home, and statements given to police. But investigators were confident about one key conclusion. Margaret Craig died inside the house during that confrontation. For detectives, the next question was what happened after the killing. And that's where the investigation began to involve a second person. Candace Craig's daughter, 19-year-old Salia Hardy. According to investigators, Hardy became involved after the killing had already taken place, and detectives say she later helped her mother attempt to dispose of Margaret Craig's remains. Statements later presented in court revealed that Hardy had heard her grandmother during the confrontation. In testimony given during the trial, she described hearing Margaret scream during the incident. The following day, according to Hardy's testimony, she discovered her grandmother's body inside the home. Instead of calling authorities, investigators say the situation took a very different turn. Your detectives believe that Candace Craig began directing efforts to hide the crime. According to statements presented during the investigation, Hardy then assisted in the attempt to dispose of the body and conceal what had happened. By this point, detectives were no longer dealing with a single act of violence. They were looking at what appeared to be a coordinated effort to cover it up. Evidence collected from the basement, including tools, trash bags, and signs of cleanup, suggested the crime scene had been altered after Margaret Craig was killed. Investigators also reviewed financial records and statements connected to the family dispute, which prosecutors believe played a key role in the events leading up to the killing. Piece by piece, detectives were building a timeline, a financial dispute, a confrontation, a threat to call the police, an attack, and then, according to investigators, a desperate attempt to hide what had happened inside the house. But as the investigation continued, authorities would soon move from gathering evidence to taking action. Because the timeline they had uncovered pointed directly to the two people who had been inside the house when officers first arrived. As detectives finished documenting the scene inside the Craig home, the investigation quickly moved into its next phase, determining who was responsible. By this point, their investigators had already pieced together a preliminary timeline. Evidence from the basement, witness statements, and the circumstances surrounding Margaret Craig's disappearance all pointed in the same direction, toward the people who had been living in the house with her. Police soon identified two suspects. The first was Candace Craig, Margaret Craig's own daughter. Candace was 44 years old at the time of the investigation. According to detectives, she had been living in the Hyattsville home with her mother and her teenage daughter. After examining the evidence and reviewing statements collected during the investigation, authorities concluded that Candace Craig was the person responsible for the killing. Prince George's County Police formally charged Candace Craig with first-degree murder and second-degree murder in connection with her mother's death. A first-degree murder charges typically indicate that prosecutors believe the killing was intentional and deliberate. Second-degree murder charges, while also serious, generally apply when a killing occurs without premeditation, but still involves malicious intent. Given the nature of the evidence discovered inside the basement, including signs of dismemberment and attempts to dispose of the remains, investigators believed the case met the legal threshold for those charges. Following her arrest, Candace Craig was taken into custody and placed under the supervision of the Department of Corrections. Authorities also made a key decision regarding her detention status. According to court records, Candace Craig was ordered to be held without bond while the case moved through the legal system. But Candace Craig was not the only person charged in connection with Margaret Craig's death, and investigators also brought charges against the third member of the household, 19-year-old Salia Hardy. Hardy was Margaret Craig's granddaughter and Candace Craig's daughter. Detectives believed that while Hardy was not responsible for the killing itself, she had helped her mother after the crime had already occurred. Because of that alleged role, prosecutors charged Salia Hardy with accessory after the fact. In legal terms, an accessory after the fact is someone who knowingly helps a person avoid arrest, prosecution, or punishment after a crime has already been committed. According to investigators, Hardy had assisted in the effort to dispose of Margaret Craig's remains. Actions prosecutors argued were part of an attempt to conceal the homicide. Like her mother, Hardy was taken into custody following the investigation and placed under the authority of the Department of Corrections while the case moved forward. With both suspects now arrested, the case officially entered the court system. Authorities scheduled a preliminary hearing for Candace Craig, where prosecutors would begin presenting the evidence gathered during the investigation. The hearing was set for July 3rd in Prince George's County District Court. For investigators, the arrests marked a major turning point. But even with suspects in custody, many questions still remained. The detectives were still working to fully understand what had happened inside the Craig home. How a family dispute had escalated into violence, and how the situation had spiraled into one of the most disturbing homicide cases the community had seen in years. Even after the arrests were made, investigators knew their work was far from finished. The discovery inside the basement had answered one question. Margaret Craig had been killed. But many other questions still remained. Detectives now had to piece together the full story of what had happened inside that home in the days leading up to the crime. The first major question investigators continued to examine was the exact motive behind the killing. Early evidence suggested that the confrontation between Margaret Craig and her daughter had been connected to money. Prosecutors later argued that Candace Craig had been taking funds from her mother's financial accounts, including pension and Social Security benefits. When Margaret confronted her daughter about it, the argument escalated into violence. But investigators still needed to understand the full timeline. Exactly how long had tensions been building inside the house? Had there been earlier disputes between mother and daughter? And what exactly happened in the moments before Margaret Craig was killed on May 23rd? Detectives began reviewing financial records, witness statements, and physical evidence collected from the home. Each piece helped them build a clearer picture of the events leading up to the confrontation. Court documents revealed that Margaret Craig had allegedly threatened to report her daughter to police over the fraudulent use of her credit card. According to investigators, that threat may have been the trigger that set off the deadly confrontation. But even that explanation raised more questions. Was the killing a sudden act of anger during an argument? Or was there something deeper happening inside the home that investigators had not yet uncovered? Cases involving family members are often the most complicated for detectives to unravel. Unlike crimes committed by strangers, family crimes often involve long histories of conflict, financial disputes, and emotional tensions that have built up over time. Investigators must carefully separate fact from accusation, and determine exactly how relationships inside the home led to the moment when violence occurred. In this case, those questions became even more complicated because of the role played by Candace Craig's daughter, Salia Hardy. Authorities believed Hardy became involved after the killing, helping her mother attempt to dispose of Margaret Craig's remains. But investigators also had to determine the extent of her involvement and how much she knew about the events leading up to the crime. Our prosecutors would later argue that the entire sequence of events, the financial dispute, the confrontation, the killing, and the attempts to hide the body, were all connected. But at this stage of the investigation, detectives were still working to confirm every detail. They continued collecting forensic evidence from the basement. They reviewed witness statements. They reconstructed the timeline of purchases made in the days after Margaret Craig's death, including items investigators believed were used during the attempted cover-up. Piece by piece, the story was becoming clearer. What had started as a simple family argument appeared to have spiraled into something far darker. A violent confrontation followed by an attempt to hide the crime. And as prosecutors prepared to bring the case into court, and the evidence investigators had gathered would soon be presented in front of a jury. But even after the legal process began, the tragedy at the center of the case remained the same. A grandmother who should have been safe in her own home had lost her life, and the people accused of taking that life were members of her own family. In the end, this case left behind more than just a criminal investigation. It left a family shattered, and at the center of the story was Margaret Craig, a 71-year-old grandmother whose life ended inside the very home where she should have felt the safest. Before her name appeared in police reports and courtroom documents, she was known by relatives as a mother, a grandmother, and a woman who had spent years surrounded by family. For the people who knew her, the tragedy was difficult to comprehend. Family members later spoke about the shock of learning what investigators had discovered inside that house. For them, Margaret was not simply a victim in a criminal case. She was someone who had been part of their lives for decades, someone who had celebrated holidays, shared meals, and built memories with the people around her. But the events that unfolded inside that home on Hill Road turned those memories into something much darker. Cases involving family violence often carry a unique kind of pain. Unlike crimes committed by strangers, they force communities to confront the reality that sometimes the greatest harm can come from within the very relationships that are supposed to provide safety and support. Investigators who work these types of cases often say they are among the most difficult to process. When violence occurs inside a family, the line between victim and suspect is often tied together by years of history, an unresolved conflict, and complicated emotional ties. In this case, prosecutors argued that a dispute over money, specifically the alleged misuse of Margaret Craig's financial accounts, triggered a confrontation that ultimately ended her life. What began as an argument between a mother and daughter escalated into violence, followed by what investigators described as a disturbing attempt to hide the crime, which the evidence uncovered in the basement would eventually lead to charges against both Candace Craig and her daughter, Salia Hardy. The legal process that followed would determine their responsibility in Margaret Craig's death. But regardless of the outcome of the court proceedings, the loss itself could not be undone. For neighbors in the Hyattsville community, the case served as a reminder that tragedies can sometimes unfold quietly, behind the doors of homes that appear ordinary from the outside. The street where Margaret Craig lived was described as a typical suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where people rarely expect a crime like this to occur. Yet inside that home, investigators say a family dispute turned deadly. Margaret Craig's death also highlights a broader issue that law enforcement agencies across the country continue to confront: violence involving family members. These cases often begin with conflicts that appear small at first, disagreements about money, personal relationships, or long-standing grievances, but over time they can escalate in ways that no one around them fully understands until it is too late. For detectives, prosecutors, and community members, the goal of telling stories like this is not simply to focus on the crime itself. It is also about remembering the person whose life was lost. Margaret Craig was more than the victim in a police investigation. She was a grandmother whose life ended in a way no one could have imagined. And the discovery that began with a simple welfare check revealed a crime that investigators say unfolded inside her own home. What began as a routine visit by police officers ended with a discovery that exposed a disturbing crime hidden inside a family household. A case that started with a missing grandmother and ended with a tragedy that would forever change the lives of everyone connected to it.